France 24 brings you the latest from across the continent. Your rendezvous with Africa. Eye on Africa on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. You're watching live from Paris on France 24. I'm Laura Cellier. The headlines this hour. Western powers to arm the government in Libya. World leaders reach a deal in Vienna, pledging to help Tripoli fight the Islamic State group, which has gained a foothold there. The decade China would rather forget. The 50-year anniversary of Mao's Cultural Revolution goes by unmarked and unmentioned. And a story about interracial love makes its debut at the Cannes Film Festival. Loving charts the story of a couple whose marriage got them jailed and exiled, but ultimately paved the way for others. The United States and other world powers have agreed to arm Libya to help it fight the Islamic State group. At talks in Vienna this Monday, leaders outlined plans to help the government impose its authority. Libya has become a haven for terrorists following the removal of Muammar Gaddafi 5 years ago. It's also become a transit point for migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. Haxi Myers-Belkin has more. Some trouble bringing you that report. We'll try and get that up for you later in the programme. But staying in Vienna, John Kerry will be joining his Russian and French counterparts at another summit in Vienna this Monday. The leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia are meeting to try and bolster a truce in the breakaway Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. 4 days of fighting there in April killed more than 100 people in what was the worst violence there in over 2 decades. The region has been in dispute since the fall of the Soviet Union. Sanam Chantier explains.
It was meant to be a new start, but after NATO-backed forces overthrew Libyan strongman Kadhafi.
If they start to attack, then we'll fight back. Their guns are just 50 meters from here. We could destroy them easily.
Newly recruited Armenian soldiers armed with Kalashnikovs standing firm at their posts.
When the enemy stops shooting, we fire back from here.
3 kilometers from the front line, the town of Martikut used to be home to 6,000 residents, but the local population has almost halved since the conflict restarted.
We evacuated the women and children. Only the men stayed.
Edek Lazaryan fled the conflict with the Azeris and moved here to Martikut in 1990. This time, despite the recent clashes, he's determined not to abandon his home. In early April, a festering conflict over Karabakh fled into the region's worst violence since 1994. 4 days of crossfire left dozens dead. Now civilians too are joining the front line. Noon is a historian, but she's signing up to fight for a second time.
When the war started, I was taking my university exams in the 90s. I was injured in the fighting. Now, decades on, it's all starting up again. Before this, we, the Armenians, were living in peace.
Relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan are at a multi-year low. Both nations accuse each other of violating a Moscow-brokered ceasefire.
And we can take a quick listen to Azerbaijan's ambassador to France. He spoke to France 24 earlier today.
Armenia needs to understand that it cannot maintain without consequence its highly condemned occupation of Karabakh or the territory around it, as this is considered illegal. For us, it's very important that as a result of this meeting between the heads of states of Azerbaijan, Armenia, as well as foreign ministers of France, Russia and the US, Armenia will be forced to respect the ceasefire and also adopt the resolutions of the United Nations Security Council.
Well, let's get some analysis on that now. Our international affairs editor, Douglas Herbert, is here with me in the studio. Hi there, Doug.
Good evening.
Now, this is a long-running but also little-known conflict, isn't it? Not many people have a great deal of information on this at their fingertips. Why then has the violence flared up recently?
Yeah, well, first of all, you're right. We rarely talk about it, right? We talk about Syria all the time, Ukraine, even Libya. Nagorno-Karabakh literally gets lost in the shuffle, and even diplomats in the international community, a lot of them have taken their eye off this ball. The reason it's flaring up is because it's an unresolved conflict. It never was solved. It was literally put on ice, hence the term frozen conflict. And occasionally, these frozen conflicts can flare up with a real vengeance when you're least expecting it. You know, in the case here, specifically, you know, we talk about we're 22 years after the date in which we had this extremely tenuous ceasefire signed between the two sides. Remember, it was Armenian-backed separatists in this enclave called Nagorno-Karabakh, which is technically on Azerbaijani territory, but they unilaterally declared independence. No one has recognized the enclave. They fought a 3-year war, 30,000 killed, 1 million displaced. It was a ceasefire. It was a truce. It was not a peace. And ever since then, Laura, what we've seen is sporadic fighting. We've had endless efforts at diplomacy and talks and unsuccessful attempts to get the sides together. We've had diplomacy at a total standstill. And as you just saw in first our report and then in the response to the Azerbaijani ambassador, two completely diametrically opposed worldviews on what this conflict is about. From Azerbaijan's standpoint, you right now have essentially Armenian separatists occupying Azerbaijani territory, Armenian armed forces in Nagorno-Karabakh. They want them out of there. As the ambassador says, he says this is an illegal occupation. Even the international community says so. They should withdraw. Now, it's not Armenia in there. Remember, these are Armenian-backed separatists in this enclave. And what they basically say is, you may say whatever you want. The geopolitical reality is, 22 years later, is we have a government, we have a parliament, we have an administration. We are a fact on the ground, and the international community has sort of come around to that view slowly. And the sort of consensus that's emerging is the only way to solve this is not by force. It's not going to be by this fighting, these flare-ups that we saw, the fighting in recent days. It's a political settlement, and that is going to mean each side has to compromise and learn to somehow get along. And right now, they're still very far apart.
Right, because just recently, more than 100 people were killed just last month. So there is a lot of motivation to contain the violence. We've got talks underway tonight in Vienna. If no solution is found, what's at stake here?
Well, obviously, what's at stake is what's been at stake for the past several decades. We'll continue with this unresolved conflict, which, like we just saw, can flare up again at any time, often with very lethal consequences. It's getting more and more dangerous, though, with each month, with each year that passes. Since the 90s, when this ceasefire was solved, we now have much more newer, more sophisticated weaponry on both sides right now. We have a region which is brimming with oil and gas pipelines, the Caspian Sea and all of its pipelines. That could obviously affect the geopolitical strategy across the region. And we have a lot of proxies, potential proxies being dragged into this war in this tiny enclave. You have Russia looking on. Russia seen, whether true or not, as being more pro-Armenia. It has a base there. And Turkey, on the other hand, Russia and Turkey are already at each other's throats. Turkey seen as being much more friendly towards Azerbaijan, so you have the potential there of a conflict. You have Georgia in the region with its own frozen conflicts and unstable, potentially, some conflicts there. You have Iran looking on. You have the entire northern Caucasus region, which has been unstable for years. It's a tinderbox, literally. And the last thing anyone needs in this region is for this war to flare up again in a way that will drag larger powers in, destabilize things in an already very volatile neighborhood.
All right, so we'll keep a close eye on what's happening in Vienna tonight. Douglas, thanks very much. Now, it's the bloody decade that China would rather forget. Chinese media was silent on this, the 50-year anniversary of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution this Monday. The exact death toll is disputed, but from 1966 until his death 10 years later, Mao unleashed a period of extreme violence and tyranny on his people. Remarkably, some are nostalgic for this period, which the government officially deems a catastrophe. Solange Mujin has this report.
A rarity in China, a museum dedicated to the country's cultural revolution. For over a decade, visitors have come to see entrepreneur Fan Jiangtuan's private collection of memorabilia, commemorating the Red Era, regarded as one of China's most divisive and deadly periods.
I have long followed the saying, "Don't speak, let the cultural relics talk." Our nation's culture and treasures need to be inherited, even if what's most important is to hand down the nation's experience and the lessons learned.
Half a century ago, on May 16, 1966, Mao Zedong launched a political and ideological movement to purify the nation of old customs, cultures, and ideas. It was also a means to discredit political rivals. It would pit students of the Red Guard against their teachers, children against their parents. Historians believe millions died. Yet today, opinions about the Cultural Revolution are mixed, with Chairman Mao remaining a revered figure for many, with hundreds of thousands flocking to his hometown every year.
The people who feel nostalgic about the Cultural Revolution are usually old, retired workers and officials from Mao's era. They feel this way because the current society is unstable and there's an unequal distribution of wealth that makes people unhappy and long for Chairman Mao.
The capitalist reforms that followed Mao's rule have led to disparities in wealth. With the current economic slowdown in China, for some, the bygone days, however dark, are often celebrated as a gilded era.
Kill criminals and bring back hanging. The president-elect in the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, has announced his first policy plan since a landslide election win last week. Duterte says fighting crime is a priority, but many are alarmed at his rhetoric. Julia Kim has more.
Arms crossed and defiant in the face of the world's press, Philippine President-elect Rodrigo Duterte outlined his first policy pronouncements since storming to victory on the 9th of May.
What I would do is to urge Congress to restore the death penalty by hanging.
The Philippines abolished capital punishment in 2006, but Duterte plans to bring it back for a wide range of crimes, including drug trafficking, robbery, rape and murder. The mayor of Davao has vowed to end crime within 3 to 6 months of being elected, pledging to kill tens of thousands of criminals, rhetoric that's outraged his critics but resonated with millions of Filipino voters fed up with the nation's endemic crime.
If you resist arrest, tapos you offer a violent resistance, my order to the police and to the military is to shoot to kill.
But police officials themselves have called Duterte's plans undoable. The 71-year-old is also likely to face opposition for his plans to offer cabinet posts to communist rebels who have battled with the military for decades. Outgoing President Benigno Aquino warned that Duterte was a dictator in the making. But others say Duterte's ruthless stance on crime is offset by his populist measures, like selling the presidential yacht to buy medical equipment. Duterte will be sworn into office on the 30th of June for a 6-year term.
Now, a drama about interracial relationships has made its debut at the Cannes Film Festival. Jeff Nichols' film Loving charts the story of a couple whose marriage got them jailed and exiled, but ultimately paved the way for others. Lisa Nesselson has this from the French Riviera.
Two American films in competition today at Cannes, both of which coincidentally have one-word titles. If the festival were to stop today, it's only at the halfway point, it seems to me, if I were on the jury, I would definitely give the top prize to a film called Loving. Loving is the last name of Richard Loving, a white man in Virginia in the late 1950s in the United States, where miscegenation was still pretty much the law of the land and definitely of the state of Virginia. He was deeply in love with a woman who happened to have black skin named Mildred. He married her in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. When they came back to Virginia, they were arrested for breaking the law and, in the wording of the laws that were then on the books, a crime against God and man, because, as you know, God put people with different color skin on different continents, and he never, ever meant them to combine. In fact, children of such a union were considered bastards. They were told to leave the state for 25 years. They risked coming back. They risked prison. She wrote to none other than Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, and the American Civil Liberties Union took up their case. It took a decade, but it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and what this brave, loving couple achieved changed the course of history. Also showing is Jim Jarmusch's film with a one-word title, Patterson. That's the first name of the main character, played by Adam Driver, who is a bus driver in Patterson, New Jersey. It's the humor of attrition. Nothing happens, then very rewarding, very funny things happen. It's kind of adorable and kind of light in a otherwise sort of heavy lineup.
Lisa Nesselson there at the Cannes Film Festival giving us her take on one of the films previewing tonight. Now, a quick reminder for you of our top story on France 24 this hour. And Western powers at a meeting in Vienna this Monday have agreed to arm the government in Libya. World leaders reaching that deal to help the UN internationally recognised government in Tripoli impose its authority on the struggling lawless state and fight the Islamic State group, which has gained a stronghold there. Well, that's our top story tonight. James Creedon is here with us in the studio now, though, because it's time for Media Watch. James, it's good to see you. It's been a while.
Indeed.
We're going to start right here in France. There's a lot of industrial unrest on the cards. I mentioned earlier that transport workers will be going on strike this week. Now, this is all about the new labour laws that the government pushed through Parliament using a little-known constitutional clause just last week. What is it looking like then the week ahead with all of this?
Well, there is an attempt by protesters to organise and to really ratchet up those protests and take them to another level, take them to a global level. And indeed, the Nuit Debout movement, or Up All Night movement, which was sparked by the labour law reform, is now attempting to... So it was sparked by labour law reform, but then it became obviously a much broader sort of movement that took in other issues as well, other questions.
I've got a question. Why do people outside France care about French labour law?
Well, this is a good point, and indeed, I think most of them don't. So there is an attempt to sort of rebrand it as something broader. Sputnik News, which is a Russian news outfit, they are talking about it as being European rallies against austerity together. Now, so the austerity question is not really the same as the labour law reform question.
The Spanish got there first with that, didn't they?
They did, I think, a little bit with Andignados and all of that. But so how is it? I suppose the question is it working? Is Nuit Debout becoming global debut? And, well, not entirely, I think, is the answer. If you look on social media, you might be fooled into thinking by certain intelligently taken photographs that the movement is more widespread and gaining more support than it is. Here you have Nuit Debout in Rome, looking like there's quite a number of people there. Here in Barcelona, quite a number of people in the streets as well. But it's important to point out, as our own website does, that actually in a lot of French cities there were 100 people. There was a picnic in Marseille with only 20 people present. So it seems to be dying down. And if you look at Le Monde, they've been looking at facts and figures, and the movement does seem to be losing steam, if you like. You can see here that it's the number of participants in the movement.
Somewhat.
It's petering out, even if the organisers wanted to go sort of global.
But we see these movements time and again, don't we? It's about young people kind of just trying to show their frustration about being left out of what they see as being left out of the economy.
That's right. And I guess those movements are becoming more frequent between Occupy, Indignados, Nuit Debout, etc. And for the organisers of, or some of the organisers of Nuit Debout, they're saying, look, if it sows a few seeds, it'll mean that there's been some success, even if the movement itself is beginning to wane. So there you go. We'll have to wait and see.
All right, now the veteran French actor Gérard Depardieu has been making some comments about the movement. He doesn't have any concerns about losing out.
He's not known for being the most diplomatic of people, or kind of keeping his comments very balanced. In any case, he gave an interview to Nice Matin. He's down in the south of France for the Cannes Film Festival, and as the headline says here, il a poussé un coup de gueule. He kind of got very colourful in terms of he lashed out at a lot of things. So what did he say about Nuit Debout? He said, Nuit Debout, it's like sitting on the toilet seat. It's the same thing. So basically, Nuit Debout means up all night, standing up, and he's saying, well, really, it's like sitting on the loo. In other words, they're not...
What a lovely image. He's good at that, isn't he?
So they're not doing anything. He said it's anecdotal. It's anecdotal. What would you say? Anecdotal.
Symbolic.
It's symbolic. And he said people are comparing it to May 1968. What is it all going to change? In the end, we're going to end up with the blonde. Now, by the blonde, he didn't mean Laura Sellier. He meant Marine Le Pen. Sorry.
Oh, dear.
That's the last time I'll compare you to.
Oh, well. Thank
you. He also made some comments about the Cannes Film Festival. which I think are quite funny.
Yeah.
He said it's all a big load of porn.
Oh.
He said you have a few.
Porn.
He said you have stars walking up the steps. You've got a few women dressed in nice dresses and everybody talking about that. He said it's just absolute porn and walking up the steps. I don't want to participate in that. Yet he's there. And what
I was going to say, a bit of a mixed message coming from old
And
General.
what's funny is there was this review by Roger Ebert, the famous movie reviewer for the Chicago Sun-Times, who died a few years ago. He wrote about Cannes and Depardieu back in 1989, saying that he was a one-man festival and he was extremely enthusiastic, loved the whole thing. It's like a teenager. He was like a teenager thrilled to have a free ticket. So what happened between 1989 and 2016?
He's become a bit blasé about it all, hasn't he? Very quickly, Bernard Cazeneuve, the French Interior Minister, he's done something strange on Twitter.
Well, somebody, and it's almost certainly wasn't Bernard Cazeneuve, liked an erotic image on his Twitter account. It was actually something to do with spanking. In any case, it's obviously embarrassing.
Well, with all the stuff about sexism in the French Parliament,
it was just a little bit embarrassing. His communications people had to come out and say, "Look."
Do you think that was a cheeky intern or something?
It might have been, or in any case, they're going to launch an investigation. But the spanking site in question that was liked, which is apparently a London-based group of discreet people who like spanking, they were delighted with the promotion and they tweeted here, "Liberté, égalité, fessé," which means spank.
Lovely. On that note, James, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, James Creedon there. Now, moving on, it's time for Monday's Focus Report. Hungary has earned a reputation for being tough on migrants. Prime Minister Viktor Orban claims that large numbers of Muslim refugees are a threat to Europe's security and its cultural identity. Well, the Hungarian parliament has just approved holding a referendum on the mandatory refugee quotas which are being set by the European Union. This just a few months after Hungary caused controversy by building a razor wire fence along its border with Serbia. France 24's Jessica Saltz has this report.
Today there are 50 people waiting their turn in the mud on the Serbian side of the border. For these migrants who decided to take the Balkan route, the final gateway to the Schengen area is these turnstiles. We are in Horgosh on the border between Serbia and Hungary. Hundreds of thousands of refugees passed through here last year, until the construction of this barrier. Taufik and his family left Afghanistan 5 months ago.
We stayed for about 3 months in a camp in Macedonia, just behind the Serbian border, before continuing on our way illegally. Now everyone in our group is tired. We have small children with us. We went through the mountains, and the road was very dangerous.
Only 20 people are allowed to enter the country each day. Women and children are the priority. Some single men wait several weeks before attempting an illegal crossing. Many of them are intercepted and transported to the city of Szeged. They are put on trial here within 72 hours. Public trials are now commonplace, like for these Afghans who we were able to film. They delivered their confessions in court.
I regret what I did. I asked the court to take as mitigating circumstances my confession and the human motivations that made me commit the act.
The defendants face up to 3 years in prison, but for them it will be only deportation.
The court sentenced the accused to a 1-year ban from entering Hungary.
This is the most severe anti-migrant legislation in Europe, and it is the pride of the Hungarian authorities. Laszlo Balázs is responsible for border protection. For him, this strategy is a success.
I don't know if there are psychological factors. We, the police, must do our job, defending the external borders of Schengen. And the figures prove that it works, because previously, before the construction of the border, there were times when more than 10,000 people passed through, and now that's no longer the case.
The Hungarian government wants to make this year, 2016, a year without refugees. The climate has become very hostile towards migrants. We are in Ashotelom, a small town on the Serbian border. The mayor was the first person to demand the construction of a fence last year.
A magyar-szerb határon fekvő Ásothalom polgármestere vagyok.
made this video after the crisis last year. It shows local police officers whose main mission it is to track down migrants.
I want them to avoid Ashotalam, because as a mayor I want to protect my town, but I can't stop the migration that is striking the whole of Europe alone. This message is for all migrants and those who organise their journeys.
He believes Hungary must refuse the European agreement to distribute refugees.
There's no question of accepting the distribution quotas. The presence of these people in Europe is the responsibility of those who sent the wrong message to migrants who arrived by the tens of thousands. It is the responsibility of those who let them come, such as Angela Merkel and Jean-Claude Juncker.
And to show the rest of the EU just how much Hungary wants to remain free from migrants, the government is commissioning around-the-clock production of kilometres of barbed wire in a prison near Budapest. 100 rolls are made by the workshop every day. Some is exported to countries including Slovenia and Bulgaria.
The installation of the machines began last fall, and we were producing full-time from December. Because this is a prison, and we are obliged by law to make prisoners work, we're obliged to take all opportunities, so it was a chance for our prison to be involved in this production.
Currently, over 200 kilometres of barbed wire are installed along the border with Croatia and Serbia. Kubakaša village is a few kilometres from the end of the fence. The mayor, Robert Molnar, takes us there. He is one of the most vocal opponents of the Hungarian government.
During 40 years of communism, we also had to live like in a prison, and this here is almost the same. Today they try to put a Christian spin on it because this regime wants to strengthen its image, but in the end, there is no difference.
He believes that the fence will stop some of the migrants, but it will not prevent a new humanitarian catastrophe. He takes us to the border crossing between Hungary, Serbia and Romania, where the new Iron Curtain stops outright.
Of course, it's not a solution to just let everyone in without any form of control. But you cannot treat people in such a cruel manner. But what is most painful to me is how the government is using those people for their own political gain.
The government now plans to extend the fence all along its border with Romania in order to build a barricade around Hungary. The migration pressure resumed with the arrival of spring. More than 200 people are crossing the border again every day.
Well, time now for a short break here on France 24. Do stay with us, more news and headlines still to come.
You love watching France 24 in English.
Analysis from France 24. I'm Mark Owen. These are the main world news.
To the border with Algeria.
Huge lines since this morning to answer that question.
But France 24 is also available in French.
14h à Paris, bonjour à tous, bienvenue si vous nous rejoignez sur France 24, c'est Paris.
And Arabic.
شعبية هذا الباب القادم من أمريكا الجنوبية في ازدياد النار.
Featured on cable and satellite systems and online media in France and across the world.